ensure that we have proper immigration law here.
Yep. Camilla Tominey, Telegraph.
Morning, thank you. Camilla Tominey for the Daily Tea. Just a personnel question, mindful of the fact that you think there's going to be a general election in 2027, and you've been very critical of the current Chancellor. You've scrapped the tax cuts that Richard Tice wrote into the contract with the people at the last general election. If Zia Youssef is now crunching the numbers for the announcements you're making today, should we presume that he's your preferred choice for Chancellor over Richard Tice now? Thank you.
Lovely try, but you should... No, it's very good. I mean, no wonder you're so well paid. But I'm just not playing your silly little game, sorry. Right, moving on to the next question. Max Kendix from The Times, who has covered the local government cancellations better than any other journalist.
Thank you. Couple of questions. One on, which was kind of asked before, but would be good to get addressed more fully. Is your aim to go into the next election making a promise not to raise any taxes whatsoever? Are there going to be solid commitments around that, or conversely, do you think there's an area that should be taxed more? And Zia, I wonder, Shabana Mahmood said yesterday, when she was being accused of being divisive by a Lib Dem MP, that she's the one regularly called an effing P word and told to go back home. Is that an experience of racism in public life that you sympathise with?
Go for it.
Yeah, well, look, I've answered this a few times this morning on the morning round. So, number one, I deeply sympathise with her for being in receipt of such appalling racism. That must be deeply unpleasant. And look, obviously different politicians have different reasons and motivations for saying and believing different things. I do somewhat take exception to this conflation with, or this association with, concern about immigration, legal and illegal, and racism. I do take exception to that because for, I think, decades now, and I've just been campaigning on this issue for decades, people in this country have voted time and time again for less immigration. Not because they're racist, not because they're running around shouting the F word or using the P word at people, but because they believe Britain should have borders, they believe in sovereignty, they believe in the rule of law, and they believe that if you pay taxes in this country, you should assume to actually get public services that make sense for you. So it's a subtle thing, and again, I have deep sympathy, of course, for anyone who receives that kind of racist abuse. Lord knows I've received abuse too, just like every frontline politician. But this notion that one should conflate concern about immigration, which, as she did in the chamber yesterday, with such appalling racism, I do have something of an issue with that.
Yeah, Melanie Phillips in your newspaper today makes some very similar points, actually, in a very powerful article. Look, we're a party that believes we need tax cuts, that the tax burden is too high, it's a disincentive. And by the way, I want lots of people moving back to Britain. I want people moving back to Britain who are going to pay lots and lots and lots of tax. Because if you drive away the wealthiest, you drive away the highest taxpayers, which means a potentially higher tax burden for everything else. But I think what we've shown you, or I believe what we tried to show you over the course of the last few weeks, is that we fully understand that we can't even talk about tax cuts until we get our spiralling debt problem in this country under control. Equally, there needs to be a big change of culture as well when it comes to work, productivity, success, and maybe we should be championing entrepreneurs that do well and make money rather than portraying them as being evil for having done well. So there are some big cultural shifts that are needed as well. No, we want tax cuts. The tax burden is too high. We're committed to doing that, but first, we're showing you that we can make the cuts and do the things that will give us the room.
Can I just say one other thing on that? And it alludes to an earlier question as well, which is that I do think there's something of an underappreciation in the media about the changing financial situation since the last general election. Yeah. And the country's finances have deteriorated meaningfully, even from the shambolic and deteriorated state they were in as a result of 14 years of Tory government. And if you were to look, and we can have this conversation again the day after the budget, but my assessment is, any reasonable assessment, assuming that Rachel Reeves does not do the things we're proposing here today, sadly, is that after the budget, just to unwind that incremental new taxes that Rachel Reeves has imposed on the British people, the mad inheritance tax changes, including on farmers, the 2% increase in national insurance contributions for employers, the sugar tax, all of these things she's talking about, will be north of £60 billion. And Lord knows we would love an early general election, but by the time we get to the next general election, in all likelihood, my view is that we're going to be at north of £100 billion just to unwind the appalling tax rises that Rachel Reeves would have implemented. So we've got to be straight up with the British people about that.
Absolutely. Jonathan Walker from The Express.
Thank you, Nigel. I think it was Zia this morning highlighted a web page that you've set up for people who are interested in defecting to reform. I don't suppose Shabana's really going to fill it in, but are you able to tell us anything about how many people have applied, and how do you decide who to accept and who to not accept?
In terms of defectors, I mean, the rule's very, very simple. We want people to come to us who we think will add to us, help us as a party, help us as a movement, as opposed to simply using us as a tool to revive their political careers. That's the criteria, plain and simple. Sophie Wingate from PA.
Thank you, Sophie Wingate from PA. On renegotiating with the EU on benefits for EU citizens, can you guarantee that it wouldn't lead to retaliatory measures and higher prices for British consumers? And have you had any exploratory talks with EU officials to see how open they might be?
No, I'm not terribly popular in Brussels most of the time, it has to be said. I think they're quite pleased to see the back of me in many ways, although the European Parliament's very, very dull now that the Brexit Party aren't there. It's a negotiation. You know, it's a negotiation, and you go into a negotiation with a very clear idea of what your objectives are and what your interests are. And your interests ought to be the national interest. And the whole disaster of the EU renegotiation from the very, very early days was it was viewed by Theresa May and others as a damage limitation exercise as opposed to a rejuvenating opportunity. And so we finished up with a very bad deal that currently the Prime Minister is trying to make considerably worse. We will adopt a different approach, and you can never predict how negotiations will go, but I do think that we have a team of people who've been used to negotiations, who know what the tough side of life is when it comes to business, when it comes to putting together contracts, putting together deals, and I would argue we've got a far better chance of doing something in the national interest than any of the careerists that have gone before us. Maurizio Alencar, City AM.
Hi, Maurizio Alencar, City AM, thank you. Some of the criticism of Labour has been on plans to create a so-called smorgasbord of tax rises based on quite volatile items. But then this package is also talking about some volatile items such as net migration. So, you know, is this savings package and slight surcharge fees package also not based on very sort of unpredictable forecasts? Thanks.
No. Just have a look at the graph. I mean, your City AM, for goodness sake. Just have a look at the trend. The trends have now been well established for several years, and actually the numbers are getting worse, and the predictions for those numbers, whether it's PIP, whether it's universal credit, all of this will be considerably worse this time next year, and even worse the year after that. The trend is very, very clear, and this is about arresting and turning around that trend.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, the only number that could in any way be described as being reliant on a variable is the one on IHS that you flagged, the immigration health surcharge. The 5 billion number we just touted as being the saving is based on the current OBR forecast for net immigration. But I also said in my speech, because we've done the numbers on this, if they cut net immigration to zero, which is what our policy is, it would still save north of 3 billion quid. So that's still 23 billion pounds, more than enough to negate tax rises.
Emilio Casaliccio from Politico.
Hi, thank you very much, Emilio. You say that you made no specific promises about council tax before those May elections, but reform local groups did make very clear promises. So what will you do to keep better control over what these people promise on essentially your behalf in local areas? And are you able to say something just a bit more in general about that experience, what councils, these reform councils are finding, the challenges that they're finding in terms of saving money or in terms of making difficult decisions for savings that actually are proving very unpopular or the government won't let them do? What have you learned from this experience of some form of governance about what you should be promising ahead of the election and how a reform government might need to kind of temper expectations?
I was incredibly careful in the run-up to those county elections not to make false economic promises. And I promise you, you will not find a leaflet officially sanctioned by the party. You will not find a clip or an excerpt of anything I said on the street or on camera or to you or wherever it may be where I made any false claims about tax and council tax. And I can assure you, having travelled and having met, I can't even think, but probably 800 to 900 of the 1,300 people that stood, 600 people that stood for us, I didn't hear anyone making false promises on council tax. So I think, you know, the messages that were coming from the central party through the senior membership team were very, very loud and clear. Lessons, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, getting anything to change in this country is difficult. It's difficult because of inertia. It's difficult because of the status quo. It's difficult because there are plenty of people living in the marzipan layer, you know, on a public sector with the promise of great pensions, with maybe not the longest working hours in the world, many of them thinking since the pandemic that actually work from home was a suitable alternative. Yeah, getting things to change is hard. I think that's perhaps the biggest thing that I take from these first few months. And that is to a very large extent why, it's getting back to the Express question really, that's very much why Danny Kruger has come into the party to oversee a team, to think, how are we going to deal with those challenges with Whitehall and elsewhere? But yeah, that's my big takeout. Okay, we're rattling through. Will Hazel from the iPaper.
Thank you. Do you support Shabana Mahmood's plan to deport the children of failed asylum seekers? Because I think earlier in the year, Reform rode back on plans to deport the children of illegal migrants in your mass deportation plan.
Look, you know, my job is not to make your life easier. And so I'm going to say this. The absolute priority with deporting those who've come illegal are young, undocumented males of fighting age, many of whom will do great harm in this country to women, to girls, join crime gangs, and that is the absolute priority, and that remains my answer. Lucy White from Bloomberg.
Thank you. I wanted to ask about steel. At the moment, the EU has proposed much higher tariffs on steel that we are trying to negotiate our way out of. If you were to torpedo relations with the EU by, for example, withdrawing from the ECHR or by treating their citizens here differently to the way we treat our own, how do you expect that to impact on these industries that are so reliant on our relations to the EU? Because the steel industry has said the tariffs at the current level that the EU is proposing would be incredibly damaging.
No, and I understand that, but that's all part of a negotiation, isn't it? That's all part of a negotiation. And, you know, when you're negotiating against someone that sees weakness, they will keep hammering you. You know, that is the world that we live in. And we've shown weakness since 2016. Time after time after time. And frankly, under Keir Starmer's leadership, it is craven weakness that we're seeing on fishing and everything else. So yes, these are issues, as are trade issues around the whole of the rest of the world. But this is about a complete reset of our relationship, and one that is much more in our national interest. And, you know, steel is a very difficult subject anyway. I honestly don't believe that if Richard Tice and I had not gone up to Scunthorpe on that day, I honestly don't believe this country would be producing any primary steel at all. And that moves on to a whole bigger debate on energy and the sheer catastrophe that net zero, that the attempt to become the Saudi Arabia of wind, and onto this government, is for not just our traditional manufacturing industries, but forget data centres, forget AI, forget crypto, forget the entire 21st century economy. If we continue with our current energy policy, we simply won't be competitive and won't be able to do it. And energy will be, very much, I think, a centrepiece of what we fight the next general election on. George Eaton, New Statesman. Nope, not here. Adam Cherry, Guido Fawkes.
Thank you. The Chancellor next week is set to announce a milkshake tax. What is Reform's position?
My favourite subject.
Right. What is Reform's position on sin taxes? You mentioned the sugar tax earlier. Would you abolish it? And under a Reform government, if I go into a restaurant, would I be able to buy a Coca-Cola and get it refilled unlimited times?
Oh, I've seen that. I mean, it's as if we're all to be protected from ourselves and kept at home, wrapped up in cotton wool. Just take tobacco. The Australians have gone bonkers. A packet of cigarettes in Australia costs about 35 quid, maybe nearly 40 quid. So if you're living in Melbourne and you're in a criminal gang, forget cocaine. There's no money in cocaine. The money's in fags. And as a result of this, there have been 40 premises firebombed over the course of the last 2.5 years, as the tobacco gangs fight against each other and burn out shops that are selling under-the-counter cigarettes. And you can go back to Adam Smith, if you like, who talked about brandy taxes. And if brandy tax is too high, guess what happens? You get smuggling. And I think when I take that down to sugar, well, clearly, there is not going to be a black market in milkshakes. I would fully understand that. But they're hot. When they're chucked in your face, they're really vile, I must tell you. I just think we're not doing enough through education and just banning things and taxing things and saying in that particularly famous chain that you can't fill up for a second time. I mean, it's just overreach on simply on the most astonishing level. Archie Earl from Unheard.
Hi there. I was wondering if you could tell us anything about if Reform has any plans to implement a Trump-style visa ban on any countries, especially in light of Shabana Mahmood's announcements.
Well, the visa ban that Shabana Mahmood talked about yesterday was actually, yes, a very sensible negotiating tactic. Why wouldn't any government looking after the national interest do that? It was one of the most attractive things I thought she said. Let's show some muscle as a country, and we can do that with Nigeria, etc. Even Eritrea, maybe, I don't know. But so there's much we could do. But I just, again, say to you that it all sounded great. It's all supposed to neuter support for reform. I just don't believe any of it with this government, this cabinet, and these backbenches, and the leftward movement that we're seeing in Labour politics. The drag that is coming now from the Greens, there won't be Jeremy Corbyn because he can't run a bath, but there is that gradual drift to the left. I just don't believe it'll ever happen. Right, 2 or 3 more. Anna Gross from the Financial Times. It would be under the hour just so.
The immigration health surcharge, in all of the documentation that I've read, it's calculated on the average cost to the NHS of migrants who are eligible for the surcharge. So I'm confused about where you got this £2,700 figure from, which I can't find. Also, when the government has increased IHS before, the number of people whose fees are waived goes up because fewer people can afford it. So wouldn't that reduce the revenue from this policy? And also, what are you going to do about the people who say, look, I literally can't afford it, and then their fees get waived?
If I was to go to Australia and work in Australia and I couldn't prove that I either had the cash in my account or the health insurance for up to 4 years, I wouldn't be let in. Zia?
Yeah, no, it's spot on, right? So the first point to make is that there's a very substantial document, which is the government's own. It's a Home Office impact assessment. All the numbers are in there, and it literally states very explicitly that the per capita, per year cost of the NHS is north of £2,700. And they the last Tory government set the surcharge at £38 of that. And you can read the document. It's a very, very long document, but it's abundantly clear that the Home Office and the government actually has no idea what the actual cost is. And the reason why I laid out, for example, it's all in there and in the document that we'll publish, but the reality is if you just looked at maternity rates, for example, contact with the NHS and per capita costs in the NHS, in reality, yes, you have an average, yes, you have a median, but it's massively driven by significant events, one of which, for example, is a birth. And the migrant, the foreign national birth rate is 30% higher than it is for British nationals. And each one of those births costs £5,500. There's absolutely no justification for keeping the number of that. Now, there are also, as you say, a number of exemptions inside the IHS. One of which would be for ILR. Now, obviously, our plan is to abolish ILR altogether, but if Rachel Reeves doesn't want to do that, she could just remove that exemption. Obviously, asylum seekers, all of these other sorts of people don't have to currently pay. Nor, by the way, I want to be crystal clear, NHS workers are currently exempt. We would retain that exemption. So we're saying even in a net zero immigration scenario, it would raise £3 billion. Based on current OBR forecasts for immigration this year, it would be £5 billion.
David Burke from the Mirror.
Hiya, thank you very much. In a hypothetical situation where a company were to go bust, it's a big local employer in an area, under your proposals, the British citizens on the workforce would have the safety net of support, but their colleagues, neighbours from the EU or from overseas in some way wouldn't. They'd also have their own living costs, their own families, etc. Do you think that's fair, and do you think the wider public think that's fair?
I just think the model that we've been pursuing for basically a quarter of a century of importing as much cheap foreign labour as we possibly can has been a benefit to some employers, especially big employers, but the net effect on the British economy, it's been catastrophic on productivity, and it has, as the years have gone by, just brought upon us a massive range of social costs through dependence, etc. We cannot continue with this current model. I understand that for some people there'll be short-term concerns. Of course there will be. But what we're saying is we have to turn this around. And frankly, to have so many millions of people of working age not working is the thing that is going to have to be addressed. Thank you. Peter Walker from The Guardian.
I'm hidden here, so I'm going to stand up. If I can return to the very, very first question of this quite long press conference, which you didn't completely answer from the BBC, has the party modelled at all what the economic consequences of your actions on EU nationals, what would be the case if the EU hit back, for example, on trade, or are you convinced that they won't? And if I may, I asked Richard this yesterday. He basically said he didn't particularly have any concerns about the views of your new head of the student organisation, who has argued quite vehemently on X that people from minority ethnic backgrounds are not necessarily British, even if they're UK born and bred. Do you share Matthew Goodwin's views? And given the fact he's in the party, does this indicate that your proud record you've talked about a lot of keeping far-right elements out of your parties, is that era now gone?
No, and we will always keep far-right elements out of our party. I've always done that. You've known me for goodness knows how many years. I've always made sure we've never had BNP types, etc. in. I think what Goodwin said, it was nuanced. And if you look at the nuance, it perhaps doesn't look as ugly as you try to make out, is the point that I would make. But of course, as soon as you set up a youth wing, you're going to have problems with everybody. And we knew that before we did it. I would argue with Europe, they're still selling us lots of cars, you know. They're still selling us lots of cars. We're still buying 20 million bottles of champagne every year. We need to get back to a basic trade agreement. And look, have we costed? There are all sorts of good and bad scenarios that can happen every single day of the week. I am confident we can come to a much better deal with the European Union. I was going to ask one last question. Robert Peston, do you have a question as you were late in the room?
I think I'm interviewing you, so can I say?
Fine, very good. Yes, one more. Sorry, I apologise. Not on my list, I apologise.
No, I'm later. Thank you. You've painted a very gloomy picture of the public finances in this press conference, but would it be fair to say that the solutions you're offering in contrast to your
It was
avowedly
Lee Anderson
radical solutions on
Rachel
immigration
from
are perhaps
accounts during
cautious.
PMQs,
25
some time
billion
ago,
savings
and that
is
really stuck.
just about
Although
half
Lee now
what the
says he
Tories
feels
suggest
sorry
they
for
could
her
find,
on a
47
human
billion.
level.
Even your PIP
and actually,
changes
I think we can all
less
understand
than
that.
what Labour thought they could
So what we're going to get
find
is a
when they
budget
first thought
that will
they
be
could manage this.
drafted by
So is that the
left-wing
message
think
you want
tanks,
to give to
a
the
budget that
electorate?
will be
We're
drafted by
radical
people
on
who've
immigration,
never
but
run
there
a
will be
business,
incremental change
who've
on
never
the public
had
finances.
a proper job. What we've given you today is just
their
one
lives,
snapshot
and that's
of
the
one
level
area.
of disconnect
we might remind
that
you
exists.
of what we said about the Boris
Now, I
wave
do
and
think we're
indefinite leave
setting
to
the
remain
pace
and what the cost of
on a
those
number of
individuals are
things.
likely
I
to
thought,
be over
despite
the course of the coming decades.
protestations, I thought a lot of what Shabama Mahmood
Yeah, I mean,
said,
it's,
yes,
it's
it was
hundreds of
driven
billions if you
directly
actually were to
by
look
fear
at
that
the
Labour
Boris wave, and
over
that is
decades,
over decades, indeed. And look, we're going to have a lot more to announce in this regard. I will say it's quite funny, though, with the media. You know, one minute we're putting big numbers out there and we're accused of fantasy economics, and then we put smaller numbers out there. That's a bit cautious.
Maybe that's our next
Here's the
defector, I'm
point.
not
Here's the
sure.
point. As Nigel said, this is a very specific set of proposals for Rachel Reeves that she could enact immediately. And by the way, that 25 billion, that compounds, as is in the document that we will share with you, that compounds significantly and multiplies over the coming years.
Very angry.
Thank you, everybody.
And she said it's, tearing the country apart.
But economically, it is legal migration that is doing enormous damage to the British economy. And it's been so difficult to even talk about this subject without being screamed down. But just look at the direct link between falls in productivity and the mass importation of unskilled labour. In fact, that trend has been there now for the best part of 20 years. There are enormous costs to our benefit system of those, not just illegally, but legally have come in to our country. And today, Zia is going to address some of that, as indeed we've touched on before. The idea that will get put at an alternative press conference today, which I understand is going on at the same time as this one, is that somehow reform support a ballooning benefits bill, and yet we're the ones proposing the most radical cuts to benefits in numerical terms that have ever been seen in the history of this country. So I'm going to ask Zia to lay out our key 5 points today. We'll then, of course, take questions on that and anything else, as we always do. But I want you to bear in mind, with all the numbers that Zia is about to give you, these are before the Boris wave. Before the Boris wave begin to become eligible. And for everything the Home Secretary has said about extending the number of years you have to be in Britain to qualify,
good morning, everybody.
whether it's for ILR,
another
whether it's for
depressing
benefits.
budget hose interview, another tax-raising budget, another budget that doesn't have the courage, the guts
of
to
this
cut
year,
public spending,
by some think
and I think the level of pessimism amongst businesses, amongst savers, amongst those that have assets of any kind
I'll now
has
hand
not
over
been
some
lower
of the details
in
you
modern
might have heard
times.
them already on
I
broadcast
think for some
media this
years
morning.
we've actually been
I'll
living
hand
under an
over
illusion.
to our head of policy.
We've not been
Zia
prepared
Youssef.
to face up to just how much of an economic mess we're genuinely in as we slip down the global league tables.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for
we kid
coming
ourselves.
and for
Well, it's
watching,
okay.
for watching this on a live stream.
We've got GDP growth.
Tough decisions need to be made. Is the
But there wouldn't
refrain
have
of
been
the
any
political class
GDP
for
growth
years, decades
over
now.
the course of the
British
last few
citizens
years
constantly being
if
told
it wasn't
that they need to
for
tighten
mass
their belts
migration
and they've got to
on a
accept
scale
paying ever
hitherto
more tax
never even
for ever
contemplated,
worse public
and
services.
of course,
While that's been
excess
happening, as we're about to
government
lay
borrowing.
out,
That is all
there has been the most
that has kept
extraordinary
GDP
ballooning
figures
of
up. And
British
indeed, I think we can
taxpayer
argue
expense
very strongly
being funneled to foreign nationals,
that on an
including on our
individual
own shores,
basis,
that you could
mass
possibly
migration has
believe.
made the average
British
Briton
state exists
poorer.
to serve
You take a
British
year like 2024,
citizens. That is quite a radical
record
idea
level
these days
of
in
people
Westminster,
coming
which is
into
why
the
Nigel
country
gets heckled
and GDP
whenever he says such
per capita
a thing inside
falling.
the House of Commons.
And
but
of course,
that
the
is what it
productivity
is
problem,
for.
well, there's
And so,
nothing
yes,
new there.
We agree.
We've been
The
suffering
country
from poor productivity
is in an enormous
going back
amount
for
of
the
debt,
best
closing on
part
£3
of 20
trillion
years.
thanks to the
We
Tories,
convinced
almost
ourselves
tripled it
that by
on
importing
their
masses
watch. We basically have no
of cheap,
economic growth to speak of
unskilled
whatsoever.
foreign labour,
Real wages
that
have barely
somehow
done anything
that
for
would be
people
good
in
for
this
our
country for the
economy.
last
Well,
two
it was
decades.
good for the wage
And
bills
we've seen
of big
the tax
companies over
burden
short
on
term,
people in this country,
but
taxes as a
catastrophic
percentage
when
of
it came
GDP
to training
at World
and
War II
education
highs. Again,
for
as
our
Michael
own
said, we can
workforce.
thank the Tory party
And when it comes
for
to the public
all
sector,
of that. The
who
question
still
is,
seem
who's
to be
going to
hooked
bear the brunt
on the
of
idea
these,
that
quote,
working
tough
from
decisions?
home
And here's our perspective.
somehow is good
It
for
is foreign
productivity.
nationals
Well,
who
we
should
see
first bear
the
brunt
disastrous
before we ask
results,
anyone,
and this is
any
something
British
that
citizens
Danny
to
Kruger
make
on our
sacrifices.
behalf
And that is the
has started
fundamental
work on
fault line right
already.
now in British politics.
But the one subject we really don't
We are
discuss,
working incredibly hard
at
to make
least
Nigel
the Conservative
Farage
and
our
Labour
next
parties
Prime Minister.
don't discuss,
And the reason for that
is
is
the
he will
level
make every
of
decision as
national
Prime Minister,
debt.
as will his Cabinet and his
In
MPs,
fact, even last week,
through the lens of what is
the
in the
leader of the
interests
Conservative
British
Party
people. So we have
was
put
saying,
together a
in
suite
office,
of proposals that Rachel
we
Reeves
cut
could
the deficit
enact
for
immediately
14 years.
in the budget she's about
Well,
to
cutting
announce
the deficit
that would amount to saving
is a very
and
different
raising
thing
25
to cutting
billion
debt
pounds, more than
when
enough
you're
to
still
plug
running
the black
borrowing
hole that she
in certainly
has
at
created
peacetime
through
levels,
her mad policies,
unlike
and
anything
negate the
ever
need
seen
for tax rises.
before.
And in most
They may
of
try
the
to wash their hands
proposals we're announcing,
and run
the
away
vast
from
majority
it.
of them,
But our
it is
national
foreign
debt
nationals
increased
who are being
by
asked
over
to
2.5
deal with the difficult
times
decisions and
during
not British
those 14
citizens.
years.
So let's run through
and now
them.
it's accelerating.
The first one is
Now it's
welfare.
accelerating in the
Now,
most extraordinary
we've already
way.
announced that
The OBR
our belief
predictions
is
for the year
UK
going
welfare
back
should be
just before
for
the
UK
general election
citizens. I think that's
was
an
that we'd borrow
entirely
77
reasonable
billion
and yet
in
the
the year.
fastest growing line
That
item
estimate is now
in any welfare bill
130
we look at
billion
where we actually have
and
data
rising
is
with
indeed
each
foreign
and
nationals. And
every
data is a key
month.
point. One of the
Our
reasons
debt
why the establishment is so worried
has
about
risen
Nigel becoming Prime
faster
Minister is because we will
than any
no longer hide
other
the data
comparable
on all of
Western
the line items of the
country.
welfare
In fact,
budget and
in
usage
the last
of the
20
NHS
years,
by
our debt
foreign
GDP
nationals.
ratio
The government,
is
the Tory
up
government and
by nearly
Labour now
60%.
continue to hide most
We are
of the
doing
line
worse
items
on
in terms
debt
of how much
than any of
demand
our
there is on those
competitors, and that
services
includes
welfare programs
Eurozone
from foreign
countries
nationals. The
who are
exception
in other
is
deep,
universal
deep
credit.
trouble. Our debt
And yet
repayments
universal
are over
credit
100
has been
billion a year.
ballooning in
They're
terms
over
of
the
foreign
level
nationals
of our
utilising it. So
defence
we are
budget.
saying we will
And the
no longer,
markets,
the British state
the markets
should no
are
longer
getting
pay
nervy. We've
universal
seen this
credit
with
payments
10
to foreign
and 30
nationals.
year
The bill for
gilt
that
yields.
will be
In fact,
in
I
terms of
think
how much that would
my own view
foreign nationals
is
are
that
taking from
in
universal
2 budgets'
credit
time,
is £8 billion
the markets
this
will
year.
actually
We
force
have assumed a
the
3-month
Chancellor
notice period to
into
be
what will be a
reasonable,
genuine
and therefore
austerity
if Rachel Reeves
budget,
were to enact
at which point
that policy, that would
the
be
left
£6 billion
and the Labour
of
Party
savings
won't
this
buy
year.
it.
The
And
next
it's why I
one
still
is
stand by
foreign
my
aid.
prediction
It is
that there will be a general election
that
caused by
British
economic
citizens and
collapse
taxpayers should be
that will
asked
happen
to fund
in
foreign aid programs when,
2027.
for example,
And just look at the
15-year-olds in
pace,
Wales have a lower
the rapid
educational
pace
attainment than
that we
15-year-olds
continue
in
to
Turkey. And by the
deindustrialise.
way,
It's all going.
That number for Welsh 15-year-olds is
Chemicals,
below the OECD
refining,
average. But I say Turkey
cement,
for a reason.
heavy
Because the British
engineering,
taxpayer has been
steel.
forced
We're
because
losing
of the inept
literally all of
political
it.
leadership in this country to send
Cars.
hundreds of millions
And
of
China,
pounds in aid
the beneficiary
to Turkey, a country
in
that,
almost every
whose 15-year-olds
single
do better
sector.
than
Why?
Welsh 15-year-olds.
Because
Charity begins at
for
home. And that's before we even
ideological
start talking
reasons,
about the fact that, for
we have
example,
chosen
while Labour was
to have the most
resisting calls for
expensive
statutory national
industrial
inquiry into the
energy
grooming
prices
gangs, they
in
were
the
wiring
world.
£19 million to
As for
Pakistan
benefits, well, the
for child
bill this year
exploitation
has ballooned to over
prevention
300
programs. That is
billion.
going to make
That is more
British
than the
people's
cost of the National
blood
Health Service
boil. It is
and defence
unacceptable for us to
added
continue to
up
be funding foreign
together.
aid at this level
So things
while
aren't
the country
happening,
is
and
in
work
the
isn't
state
even
that it
paying.
is currently in.
Our
Of
million
course,
lowest paid
we would
workers
aspire in the long
would all
run
be better off
to do foreign aid. Why wouldn't
if they
we?
claim
But
to have
charity begins at home,
mild
and it is unacceptable
anxiety.
to ask
That is the
hard-working
level of
British
mess
people
we're
to pay
in.
ever more tax
One of my
to
own great
fund these programs.
frustrations
So we are proposing
is that
a hard
Brexit
cap of
has
£1 billion
been squandered.
on foreign aid.
The
That would still
opportunity
allow us to
to
ring-fence
sensibly
our commitments
deregulate.
to Ukraine,
The opportunity
and it would allow
to
us to
become
keep our seats at
competitive
multilaterals like the
globally.
UN
All of that
and
has
the
been
IMF.
squandered. And the
That
worst
would
thing
still
is
save £10 billion
that
a year.
regulations regulations
The next thing
and the way
we talk about is the
regulators
immigration health
behave with
surcharge.
British
now,
business
this is actually quite extraordinary.
is now worse
because the
than
government's
it was
own impact
at the time of the
when
Brexit
it was
referendum
recently
vote,
increased to £1,000
and I apply that
roughly
with
a year,
knowledge
stated very clearly
from
that
everything
£1,000 merely
through the financial
represented
services
38%
industry
of
to
the actual
the
per
fishing
capita,
industry.
i.e. per person,
Now,
per
we
year
believe
cost of
that the
using
fundamental
the NHS.
problem
That's literally in the
behind
document.
so
That's not
much of this, and
speculation,
yes, of
it's in the
course,
impact assessment.
there are global
And yet
trends.
the
Yes,
Tory
of course,
government
these
signed
things
off on
are
an effective
factors.
62%
But there is a
discount
fundamental
for foreign
problem
nationals
at the
to be
heart
able
of the
to
way this
use
country is
our
run.
NHS. And I'll give you just
It's the
one
people
example, and this is a
that
very
are
long
actually
document. It's online,
doing
you can
it.
go and read it. It's
We're
abundantly
run
clear the government
by a
has actually
group
got no
of
idea
human rights
how much the
lawyers,
true cost
not
of foreign nationals
entrepreneurs.
using our
Virtually
NHS
nobody on
actually
the
is.
front
But I'll give you
bench
just one data point
has
to
ever taken a
demonstrate
risk,
why any sort of
ever
discount
borrowed money,
is totally
ever set up
morally
a business,
reprehensible and
ever had to
economically
meet
illiterate. Let's look at
that
maternity rates.
monthly or
The
weekly,
birth rate for
depending
foreign
what you
nationals
do,
relative to British
payroll.
citizens is
There
about
is no
30%
understanding at all.
higher.
The disconnect
Each birth costs the
between
NHS
the conversations in
£5,500.
Westminster
That is
and,
one
frankly,
reason why, by
in
the
much
way,
of the media too,
maternity boards,
and
just
what
like
is happening in the
GP
real
surgeries
economy
and many other
is
parts
a
of the NHS
gaping
are totally
chasm.
backed up. I want to give you
Well,
another data point
I
on
have
the
to tell you,
NHS because we've already started
it's
doing
even
quite a lot
worse
of
when
work
you
on
think
what's gone wrong. And
about
the
who
fact
runs
of
the
matter
departments.
is this. The
Oh, let's put a minister in
population
charge of
explosion has
railways, shall
brought
we?
the NHS to
They can
its
oversee
knees.
HS2.
Since 2010, the population
They've never worked
grown
in
by about
railways.
10%.
They've no
roughly.
knowledge
And
of railways.
Almost all of that, north of 90%
They haven't got a clue
of that
what
is
they're
through
doing.
immigration.
And yet,
what's happened to
we
real,
managed to have
i.e.
18
adjusted
rail
for inflation,
ministers
NHS
in
spending,
the space
it's
of
almost
14
doubled.
years.
It's almost doubled to
And this
deal with a
applies
10%
in department
increase in the
after
population. And
department.
insanely, and
People
again, we
whose
thank the Tory
only
government for this,
qualification
the country has fewer
is to be a
NHS beds
member
since,
of Parliament.
Since 2010.
As if
so
that's
it is
enough.
clear that the marginal cost
As if
to
that's
serve in
enough
pretty much every vector
to give a
in the
lead,
NHS
to give a
scales
guide
in
over all the things
really
that
non-linear
really
fashion,
matter
in
our
exponential
life.
fashion,
Now, if we had a
once
Parliament
capacity constraints
made up of
are
more experienced
exceeded, and that is
people
exactly
from
where
a
we
broader
are.
range
Unless
of
we
life,
get this population
that may be okay.
explosion under
But
control.
the current
and Nigel has talked
convention
about this for
that both
decades.
parties stick
The
with
NHS will
just
not be
simply
able to
doesn't
recover, and that
work.
is really important.
In fact,
we can
frankly,
make a start. We can
you think
make a
about
start by
it
no
really
longer
is a
offering
farce,
foreign
isn't it?
nationals
You're
a
put in charge of a big
62%
department,
discount on being
and then
able
after
to
14
use
months,
our NHS.
well, you've just about got your feet
We
under
can
the
then talk
table.
about
Keir Starmer,
foreign
or whoever
prisoners.
else it might be,
So we've known for some
decides
time now that north
to
of
reshuffle
10,000 foreign nationals
And so
languish
my promise
in
is
our
that
prisons.
reform
And
will not
remarkably,
just
countries
think
like Pakistan, to
differently,
whom this country sends
but
hundreds
reform
of millions
will
of pounds
do
in aid every
differently.
year, are inept
We will sweep
politicians,
away
for
these
whatever
outdated
reason, are
conventions.
unable to even get Pakistan
We will
to take back
become
their convicted
the
criminals who are
most
sitting in our jails.
pro-business,
And we're still sending them
pro-entrepreneurship government
hundreds of
that has been
millions of pounds
seen
in foreign
in this
aid
country
and issuing
in
them
modern
visas
times.
in all sorts
We'll bring
of
into
different
government
ways.
as advisors
And in fact,
or
so that would
ministers,
save £500
people
million
with real
adjusted
business
for,
expertise
for deportation
in
costs.
their
That's based
own
on onward
sector.
data that was published
And we will signal
this week. And
what
then
we
you
hope
have the
and
PIP
believe and what we know we need to be a change of attitude in this country.
Now, by the way,
a change of
most
attitude
of these numbers,
towards
Nigel
hard
mentioned
work.
ILR.
A change
The
of
numbers I'm
attitude
giving you,
towards
the 6
making
billion
money.
in the form
A change of
of
attitude
savings this year
towards
with a halt
success.
welfare payment,
And I would like to think this would begin
foreign nationals, the
in our
10
schools,
billion saving
that
in
we'd
foreign
have
aid, the
more
5 billion,
national
by the way,
champions, that we take
immigration
people
surcharge
who come
increase,
from nothing
would
and become
raise,
successes
this year.
and make them heroes,
All of these
make them
numbers
role models
compound
for younger people to
dramatic
follow.
rates over the coming
Because
years. Those
believe
numbers
me,
I've given you
that
are
is
just for this
very,
fiscal year,
very
because we're
badly
talking about
needed
plugging the black
indeed.
hole and
And perhaps
negating
it's
the need
appropriate
for tax rises. But
that
to
this
give you an
speech
idea
is
on
being
this,
given in this magnificent
in that press conference, we said
old
by
banking
2029,
hall,
the PIP reforms
right here
that Lee and
in
I
the heart of the city of
proposed
London. Now, it's a place that
would
I
save
know
£9 billion
incredibly well,
per year in 2029.
having spent much of my
Namely,
working life
no
here,
longer paying for
and generations of my family
non-serious
before
anxiety,
me that worked
but actually
here.
putting those people on
It is a very
back-to-work
special
programs,
place
all
because
of
it
the academic
symbolises
research in Europe shows
what
that
is still,
that is
despite
the best
everything,
possible thing you could actually do for the
Britain's
recipients
biggest
of that welfare
industry.
too, many of
We
whom
never
are very
talk
young
about
and being
it.
tossed on the scrap heap.
Parliament
But
really
this year,
debates
that would
it.
still save £3.5
Financial
billion. So you
services
top all
are
of
Britain's
those
biggest
numbers
industry.
up, you get to
But
above
what sad decline
25
we are
billion
currently
pounds,
in.
and these are savings
We have an
Rachel
EU
Reeves
rule book
could choose to make
that is almost
in
entirely
her budget
in
that
place.
is coming up.
And
we
that
urge her to
is
make
interpreted
these changes.
by
And the
massively
fact
overzealous
that despite us
regulation.
doing this press conference
The
and I'm
costs
pleased, the likelihood
of
she will
doing
choose
business business
not
in
to do
London,
those things and instead
the costs
choose to
of doing
raise
business
taxes
in our
on
financial
British
services
people
industry
is
are
because
now simply too
Labour
high.
is making the
And
conscious
we're losing
and deliberate
business
decision
to
continue
places
funding
all over the world,
extortionate
New York,
amounts
the
to
Far
foreign
East,
nationals to
you
the detriment
name it.
of British
There is, of course, one
citizens. And I
booming
don't know
sector
what to
here,
call
though.
that, frankly. in my
That
view,
is HR and
treachery.
compliance.
I think it's appalling. British
And Richard
people are
Tice and I
sick
were talking about
and
this earlier.
tired of it. So
The
those are our
FCA
proposals.
now incredibly have
and we're pleading with Rachel
5,000
Reeves.
staff.
Let's enact these.
It was 2,000
Let's
staff
raise and save
when I left the
£25
city
billion pounds. Plug the
just
black
over
hole
20
that you've
years
created and
ago.
put British people first.
And still
Thank you
we
very
carry
much.
on with our outdated practices. We still have stamp duty on share transactions and wonder why IPOs and stock trading in London
And that is the central message of today's press conference, that putting up taxes
state.
in this budget
We have an
is a choice.
FCA
It's a choice.
keen now to push a
Chancellor is
diversity
going
agenda.
to choose to make.
As if
whatever
diversity in
form,
the city is
in the
what
end,
matters.
they
Well, when
manifest
I worked
themselves.
here,
What
it
we
didn't
do
matter what
know
religion you were.
is that an
It
increase
didn't matter
in
where
tax
you came
burden
from.
is
Didn't matter what
demotivating.
class you were. Didn't matter what colour you
sending
were.
more and more
When I
people
worked in the
abroad.
city,
I really worry,
it was based on,
particularly
are
about
you
the number
good
of
enough?
30-something
It was based on being a
entrepreneurs, people
meritocracy.
like him,
And that
who
coincided,
are
I think, with
leaving the
London
country
being
because they
at
just
the
really
most
fear and
dominant
worry
position in
about the
financial
direction
services
that we're
it's
going
been
in.
certainly
And once again, I
in
want to
modern
reiterate,
times.
we as a party are
And then we have the
proposing
banking industry.
massive cuts in spending,
Not
and particularly
necessarily
massive
always been
cuts in welfare
my
spending. We're the
favourites
first people
over the course of the
really
last
to have
few
the courage
years.
in modern times to lay any
But they, of course, are
this
forced
out.
to implement
Now, as ever, we would take our
4
questions beginning
major
with our favourite
European Union
broadcaster, the BBC,
money laundering
and Alex
directives.
Forsyth.
All, of course, put in place with the very, very best of intentions.
Thank you very much.
But that has led to the
You are talking again
debanking
today about some
of
pretty big
hundreds
numbers,
of thousands
25
of
billion. Can I just
individuals
press you on the
and
workability
tens of
some
thousands
of
of
what you've
businesses
announced? You said
across
you
this
would
country
stop foreign
through
nationals
no
claiming
fault
universal
of their
credit,
own,
including those with
at the
EU
same
settled
time
status.
as
That's
the Turkish
protected by the
barber
withdrawal
shops
agreement. What gives you any
proliferate
sense
along with the
that the
cash
EU would
car washes
renegotiate
right across
that agreement?
our
And if you
country.
say you'd act
Our regulators are
unilaterally,
using
have you done
sledgehammers
any
to
analysis
miss
of
the
potential
nut.
costs
It's
when it
just
comes to
not
possible
working.
retaliation by the EU, including on
with
trade?
the banks not able
Well,
to
just,
act
I
as
mean,
they
firstly,
should,
on
it's
this
led
point,
to the
on
growth
numbers,
of secondary
the
lending.
last accurate
That market
figures we have
exploding,
are
and
2015,
something which I predict
at which
will
point
come back to
there were
bite us
4
very, very
times
hard,
the
as it
number
did
of EU
decades
nationals
ago.
in the UK
And we've
getting
totally
benefits,
ignored
as there were UK citizens
the whole
in Europe
new
receiving
world
any
out
kind
there.
of benefits. But the
Folks,
numbers
it's
since
happening.
then have
We're being
exploded.
left behind.
Yeah, and so
There's a
since
global
then,
boom
the number
in the
of
trade
EU
in digital
nationals
assets,
in the UK claiming
in the use
welfare
of
has
stable
increased
coins,
sevenfold.
in the usage
Sevenfold.
and
So the
investment
facts on the
in
ground
all
have
forms
changed. And
of
therefore,
cryptocurrency.
look, we have a choice.
We've literally
You have
turned our
government, which
backs
we've had
on
now
it.
for
Both
years,
the
that
Bank of
throws their
England
hands up in the
and
air
the
and say,
FCA
numbers
being
like,
guilty
for
of
example,
this. The
foreign
reason the city
nationals claiming
succeeded
universal credit,
for
that was
hundreds of years
950,000
is
about
it
3.5
innovated.
years ago.
It
3.5
took
years
risks.
ago. That
It
number is now
saw what the future direction of markets and consumer and
350,000
customer
more foreign
and
nationals
commercial
claiming
demand
universal credit in
would
this
be.
country. That's
And we
happened
have
in
done
3.5 years.
absolutely
So
none
you
of
tell me
it.
this, are
And
we supposed
frankly,
to
I believe
just
it's a
stand by and allow that
disaster.
get to
We
2
should be
million,
leading the
2.5 million,
world
3 million, or are we
in
actually
these
going to say, sorry,
21st
we actually need to
century
renegotiate this
businesses.
because this is patently
So our aim
unfair.
would be
Well, the whole relationship
to
with the European
sensibly
Union needs renegotiating.
deregulate
It
a
appears that
rule
the
book
Starmer approach is surrender,
that was written for the European Union,
started with our
not
fisheries,
written for the
starting
City
to
of
make
London.
contributions
To
again,
think
and the whole thing is
globally,
mad. It is
and to
most
have a much
certainly
more
not
open debate
what
with the
people
Bank of
voted
England.
for. And they were very, very clear.
It seems that Parliament
You know,
thinks all the
Labour
Bank
in the
of England have got
general election were
independence.
very, very clear
Well,
there'd be no,
they've got independence over
backturns
monetary
at all,
policy. They
on
don't
our
have
relationship with the
independence
EU, and there've been several
over
already.
fiscal
But look,
policy.
you know,
And it was
the
Richard
relationship
Tice that
clearly
pointed
on
out
this,
18
given the
months
explosion
ago
of numbers,
the vast
the
sums of
relationship is
money
hopelessly out of kilter.
unnecessarily being
We'd like to
paid
negotiate
in
something with
interest
the
to
EU,
banks.
to show
And now
we're
we've
good
moved to
neighbours
quantitative
on a
tightening.
reciprocal and fair
Well, they're on course
basis.
to lock in losses
Carson,
of
next up,
150 billion pounds. This has a major fiscal impact on this country. I haven't heard Rachel Reeves
the NHS surcharge to have
talk about it
waiting
once.
times, and is that money
Which,
that,
given she was
is
10
that ever
years
going
a
to be
very senior
reinvested into
economist
public
over there,
services,
I
or
must
is
say
that
I
only ever
find,
going to be a
I
saving
find
for-
very,
for
very
the public
surprising
purpose? And just
and
on
a total
Home
rethink
Secretary's
of
announcements
what the
yesterday, do you
FCA
think
is.
that they will stop
Markets
the votes?
need sensible regulation
Look, I thought that what,
users
the
can
Home
trust.
Secretary
And
said
you know
yesterday,
something? They don't
in
need
rhetorical
a whole lot
terms, was
more
extremely
than that.
encouraging.
And don't forget, when I talk about the
Extremely
city, I'm not just talking about
It's
here
just
and
that in
Canary
realistic
Wharf.
terms,
I'm not just talking
I'm not quite sure that it will
about
survive
Mayfair.
around backbenches.
I'm not just talking
and
about a few
in
very high earners.
And
I'm talking about an industry
that actually works.
that employs hundreds
you
and
can tell the
thousands of
judges,
people in every
please
major town
interpret
and every
at least
major
the
city
HR and the Human
in
Rights Act
this
differently,
country.
but in
that is
practice,
how
you can't
fundamentally
actually make them
important
do that.
it
in
is.
the current group that we've got.
The
So,
whole economy
frankly,
must
I
encourage
don't actually
innovation.
think
We must
that most of
encourage
what you
ambition,
said
and
will
yes,
make any difference at all.
dare I say it,
And as for the
risk
gimmick,
taking.
we're going to take away
Free
people's
markets work
watches and earrings.
because people
and, I
take
mean,
risks.
This is just never going to
And
happen.
if it goes wrong,
and even in
it's
Denmark,
not the job
which of, course is
of
what they were
governments
citing,
to bail them
even
out.
in Denmark, I think
It's
only
the job of their
17
shareholders
have
and their
had valuables
bondholders to
removed
lose
from them.
all of their
and by the way,
stake. And
Denmark
we
too,
need
now
so
beginning to
much
struggle
more than that.
with its own
But to be that kind of
directly
economy,
as a result
we have to
of
have
the
the right
European Court of
people
Human Rights.
in our country.
So, look,
that breed of
rhetorically,
people that
fine,
will take
following very
astonishing
many of the
risks,
things
that
that we've
breed
been
of
saying
people
for
who'll
some
give up their
years,
lives
but in practice,
dedicated to a particular
I doubt
project that they
much
wish
of it will
to
actually
succeed.
happen.
And the numbers on
Yeah,
that
and
aren't
on your
looking
question
very good.
regarding the NHS, look, we've
The
made
exodus
this
is
press
real.
conference, and our proposals are to plug the
An
current
estimated
fiscal black hole that Rachel Reeves has
16,500
created so
very
that
rich
it
people
is
will
not
leave this
necessarily
country
go to
this
raise
year.
taxes on British people.
But a total of about
with
80,000
regards specifically to the
people
NHS
will
surcharge,
leave
we
this
actually
year
read that impact assessment.
seeking
The changes
jobs,
we're proposing would not
seeking
have
work,
that
seeking
meaningful
opportunity
delta on demand,
elsewhere
even if it did.
around
Frankly,
the
there's
world.
far too much
And yes,
immigration.
many of our brightest, youngest,
thank
most
you,
ambitious
Jasmine
people
Cameron,
have
Chilesh,
simply
ITV
had
News.
enough. We're living through a wealth drain, but we're also living again
Thank you, Jasmine
through a
Cameron,
late
Chilesh,
1970s
News.
style
You say these cuts
brain
will
drain,
raise around
and
£25
we
billion.
intend to reverse
Is it your
all
expectation
of
that
that.
if they go ahead,
The
a reform
non-dom, and this is
government wouldn't
unpopular.
have to
You
increase
talk about
taxes,
this,
such as
oh, you can't
national
just talk about
insurance
rich
or
people. Well, I'll tell you in a moment why we need
just
to.
secondly, if I may,
The
Home
non-dom
Secretary
tax
has urged
changes
you, Mr.
started, of
Farage,
course,
to
by
quote,
George
sod off after
Osborne,
he suggested she was auditioning
accelerated
to join
by
reform.
Jeremy Hunt,
What's your response?
finished
And
off
just
by
to confirm,
Rachel
would
Reeves,
reform MPs vote with
is
the government on their
a
asylum changes if needed?
self-induced act
Yeah, I did notice actually
of
Robert
financial
Peston arriving in
stupidity.
the room just
These
as we
people
started.
pay their UK
well, she seems
taxes.
to quite like
These
using
people
bad language,
employ
doesn't she,
a lot
the
of
Home
people.
Secretary? There's been quite a
These
bit of it
people
over the course of
invest
the last
in British
48 hours or
businesses
so.
and British industries.
I mean, look,
these
for her
people
to
are
say
the
she's
biggest
not in the least bit
spenders
interested
in
what reform
the
has
country.
to say is clearly
but off they go.
utter
Milan
rot. They're
welcomes
obsessed
them with open arms,
with what reform
as has
to
Lisbon.
say. Just
over
look
the
at every
course
Prime
of the last
Minister's
few
questions
years.
on a Wednesday.
Athens
And
now
look at the
doing
Prime
the
Minister
same.
or every
Dubai,
other front bencher that gets
Dubai,
up in
quarter of a
any
million
single
Britons.
debate.
Quarter of a
And if
million
reform
Britons
didn't exist,
now
would she
living
have made those
in
announcements
Dubai
yesterday?
alone.
No,
And that's
she
why we've
would not
introduced
have
the
done.
idea of the
In
Britannia
terms of the
card.
vote, then I'll pass to
A
Zia.
one-off
In terms
payment
of how would we
for
vote,
non-doms to come back,
well, in terms of the rhetoric,
settle
we
here
support it.
and pay all the relevant
But in
tax
terms of the
on
reality,
their UK income.
why would we vote for something?
The same is
if we're
true
convinced
of
that
those
it
that are
can't
wealthy with
actually
assets. They're
work?
fleeing.
I also wonder,
They're scared of wealth taxes.
when will this
but
actually
what they're
come
even more scared
before
of
Parliament in the
is
form of primary
retrospective
legislation?
tax
Or is this just another,
changes. And it's
as
happened.
we saw with Rishi's
All through the
Stop
90s,
Votes,
I ran my own
is
company.
it just another
I put
of one
money
of these
aside
big
every year.
performative
I didn't take the
exercises
family to
to say to the
Barbados.
Red Wall
I didn't
audience
buy
that
the
we're
kind of
really
cars
with
I'd have
you.
liked.
You don't
I
need
put
to go
money
away
aside.
and
I
flirt
thought, well,
with
that's
those
there for a
ghastly,
pension, and if I snuff
reform
it,
types. When
it's
is this
there
actually
for the
going to come
family.
before Parliament? Because there are many
That
other
is now
things
subject
this government
to
have promised and
inheritance
haven't
tax.
yet
People are scared
made their way through
of retrospective
primary
taxation, and
legislation.
even scared now
Yeah, and
of
listen,
the idea
I would just
of an
comment
exit
my
tax.
personal perspective on
But
this.
perhaps the biggest disaster
is
are young
that
professionals who
it
are
was Keir
caught
Starmer who
in the
accused
£100,000
Nigel
a year
of being
tax
racist,
trap,
if you remember.
and young
And I put it
entrepreneurs
to you
who want to
that
get on.
if Nigel
They're leaving,
Farage had sat at
and
a
we
press
want them
conference
back
and
in this
announced that the
country.
reform
And
government
this
would start
hard
taking jewellery
left
away
socialist
from
dogma
people coming across in small boats,
that it's popular
Lord only
to
knows
tax the rich,
what would have happened.
that the rich
and
won't
I take great
move,
exception to
they'll
that.
stay
Actually. I
and
do
pay
take great
more.
exception to
That, I'm
to
afraid,
that. And I'd
has
also,
infected
one
virtually
of the
the
points about
entirety
that
of
particular
our
policy is
political
my view
class,
is clearly
and it's
entirely
wrong.
performative.
So let
I
me
don't know
make
who
it
they think
clear.
is coming across by small
I
boats. It's
want
not
as
50 Cent
many
and Lil Wayne. And so therefore,
high-earning people
taking their gold
as
chains away is not
possible
going to raise
living
anything
in
like
this
enough money to
country
make any
and
dent
paying as
on
much
the
tax
asylum budget.
as
But
they
look,
legally
the savings
have
that
to.
we have outlined
Because
here,
if the
as I
rich
said,
leave
we put them together carefully
and the rich
because
don't
they are
pay
things
tax,
that Rachel Reeves
then
can
the
actually enact.
poorer
Case in
in
point being, for
society
example, we have put in a
will
3-month
all
notice period
have to
on
pay
the
more
ending
tax.
of
It's as simple
universal
as that. What we're
credit
doing
payments. These are
is
things,
crazy.
these are not
And we need those
fancy,
people
these are
back,
real things
although I have
Rachel
to
Reeves
accept
could choose to do. And as Nigel
that
said,
coming back into London
these are choices
will need
Labour
not
is
just
making.
sensible tax
Yes,
rates.
and it's before.
Not just the government
It's
they
before.
fear.
Just look at the graph.
It'll need
Look
law
at the
and
trend.
order
Look at those
on
that will
London
get
streets
benefit rights over
sorted
the course
out.
of the next 3
Something
years,
that
and
Mayor
understand
Khan appears to be
that the
oblivious
numbers we
to,
talked about today
but is given
will
by
be
some
significantly
now
bigger
as another
at the end of this
reason
Parliament,
for leaving.
which won't be in
London, the
2029,
capital
I'm
city
pretty
city of
confident
Britain
about that.
in which
Moving
you're
on,
too
Tamara
scared
Cohen,
to wear
Sky
a watch
News.
walking down the street.
Thank you, Tamara Cohen, Sky News.
Right at the heart
You're talking about finding
of
these
what we intend
massive
to do
savings,
to
reform for
reindustrialise
Empower
Britain
in various
using the
councils.
fact we have
You
rather
promised
greater
massive
knowledge.
savings then.
We're not stuck to
They've
dogma
struggled to find
in a way the other
those
parties
savings,
were.
and many of them are
Has to
looking
be
at
to
raising
deal
council
with the
tax.
energy
Why should voters
industry.
feel reassured it'd be any
It's as if a
different
new
if you were
religion
in power nationally?
I did not
overtook
make
the
a single
Commons
promise, not a
in Blair's
single
time.
promise
It was
in that election
reinforced by
campaign
Call Me
that
Dave.
we'd be able to freeze or cut
Vote blue,
council
go
tax.
green.
I never said it once. And do you know why?
We then saw
Because
Theresa
I
May
realised the massive debts
put net zero into
that we were
law
inheriting
without even
from
having
those
a
county
vote
councils.
on the
It's
floor of
such
the
a
House of
shame.
Commons. It wasn't
if
needed.
you guys had focused on local
Because
government
everybody agreed.
before
And now,
the
of
May
course,
the
we
first
have.
elections, maybe
Now,
the
of course,
levels
we
of
have
debt would not
Ed
have been as
Miliband,
bad as they have.
whose fanaticism
Now, of course, There's
has
a huge
taken things
focus
to a whole
on county councils
new
up and down
level.
the country.
Well,
Richard
he's in
Tice laid
competition
out
with Boris.
very clearly yesterday
He wanted us to be the
in a
Saudi
press conference,
Arabia
£330
of wind.
million of savings.
Somehow they
we've
all seem to
already
think they're
made,
saving the planet.
But he also
The
made
truth
the bigger,
is,
broader
what
point,
they're actually
which
doing
links actually directly
is they are exporting
in what we're talking
carbon
about today,
dioxide
that there is a
emissions
massive problem
to
with the
manufacturers
Senate budget.
and
A
companies
massive
that operate
problem
under
with the Senate
lower
budget.
environmental
And this is
standards.
going to need
And
national
just look
government
what it's done to the price.
to work with local government.
And you'll hear
to reduce those
evasion after
burdens.
evasion
And
about
it's
the
a case
genuine
of
cost
diagnosis. It's a case of
of renewable,
misallocated budgets.
intermittent,
It's a case
unreliable,
of some of the most
renewable energy.
extraordinary expenditure.
But our
I mean,
electricity prices
wouldn't
are
mind owning a taxi
4
firm in
times
Lincolnshire. It
that
sounds like very
of the
good
United
business.
States of
so there are a
America.
lot of,
Double
a lot
that
of the impact
of most
on those
of
local
our
councils
European
does
competitors.
come from national
And
government
we've done
policy.
this to
Are we
ourselves.
determined to
It
make
is complete
changes? Yes.
and utter madness.
Will we cut debt?
You can have as much solar
Yes.
and as much
But
wind
can we give people
as
a
you
free
want.
ticket at this
But
moment
frankly,
in time on council tax?
the grid
No,
that we have,
and I never,
without
ever
spending 2 to
thought we
3
would be able
trillion
to at
pounds
this stage.
updating
But
it,
I think the analogy
cannot
that was
cope
given
with that intermittent
yesterday, if I
energy,
listened carefully
which is
enough,
why we now pay
was that we're
wind
12 minutes
turbines
into a
to
90-minute
turn
game.
off
Did I get that right?
when there is too
Well, there you are.
much wind.
Marvellous.
The lunatic cost
Let us
of
move
net
on to
zero
Martin Beckford
is
from
continuing
the Daily Mail.
deindustrialisation. 3 or 4 more years of this, there'll be very little manufacturing left in Britain at all, believe me.
Tax by the maximum allowed
And when you think about it, it's really quite mad, isn't it? Because
they can't do that. Thank you.
we're not just seeing the closure of our refineries and everybody else,
they
who
are
for many
their own
cases,
living,
energy
breathing
contributes
organisms.
40%
I would very, very much hope
of their overall bill.
any council tax
But we're even
rises
conning
will be
ourselves.
limited to
Now, the Prime
inflation.
Minister talked
That is
about
very
AI.
much my aim and aspiration.
We're going to be an
for
AI
our
centre.
councils.
Oh, no,
But I
we're
repeat
not.
the point. If you
Because the
actually
new
look at
energies,
the
the new industries
inherited
use
massive,
more energy
massive
than the
debts.
old heavy
Massive debts.
manufacturing
It isn't just at a national level
industries.
that the country's
If we
in
want to
trouble,
be
it's
involved
in
with
big
data
trouble
centres,
at a local
with
government
crypto,
level too.
we're going to need
But I
to
would
use
just want
more
to say one more
energy
thing,
than we've
if I
ever
can on this,
done before.
and it is that last
and
year,
even,
7
even with this massive
county
amount of
councils
expenditure that we
had their
put
elections cancelled
through subsidy and much else
in the name
into
of
wind,
local
for
government
example.
reorganisation.
There were days in January this year
This year,
when we were importing
we understand, and in fact, the Times, I think, have covered
25%
this
of our
better than
energy,
any other
and it was coming from
newspaper.
Norway, across
But
the other side of
leaders
the
of
North
those
Sea,
Tory
and it was
councils
coming from Belgium
are urging the
and from
government
Holland. At some point,
to postpone
on the
the
current
elections
course, energy
again.
won't just be expensive,
because they're
but the
worried
lights
that
actually will
reform
go out.
might win
So
them
we will scrap
and oppose
all net
the local
zero
government
subsidies. We
reorganisation.
will
And
bring
imagine
down
that.
the cost of
Imagine the
energy.
democratic will
We
of
will
the
get
people
rid of the insane
being discovered.
North
So we
Sea
will
taxes
challenge
put on
very
by
strongly
Jeremy Hunt,
the
and
government
then a bit
and
added
say,
on the
let's
top
go ahead with
by
the 7
Rachel
county council
Reeves.
elections. And by the way,
Let's get the North
part of
Sea
that debate
operating. Let's have a
will be
look
how we've run
at some of the
other
new onshore
county
gas
councils.
fields that have
Let
been
the
found
public
in this
judge.
country.
So I would
that
urge
will
that
produce
very-
tens
Otherwise
of
you're gonna
thousands
have
of well-paid
elected
jobs.
Conservative county
And we've
councils
we've
who
given
will,
notice already
by the time this
to
proposed
the
local
renewables
government
industry
reorganisation goes
that
through.
the current
They've
insane
actually sat in their positions
AR7
for
round
7
of wind
years.
auctions,
I think democratically that's
where it would
unacceptable
appear that Ed
at
Miliband is happy
any
to
level.
lock in for the
Martina
next
Beck
20
from the Sun.
years prices that are 30, maybe 40 or
Thank you very
50%
much.
higher
You want to cap foreign
than
aid
the
at
current
1 billion, but do
already
you think that
exorbitant
should come with
price.
conditions? For
We've given
example,
notice to
making
those
every penny
companies
of
that if we're in
conditional
government,
on countries
we will
taking back
scrap
illegal migrants, for example.
those
and if they
contracts.
refuse, then they get nothing.
Longer
and just
term,
quickly, on
we
the
believe as a
confiscation
party
scheme of
in
jewelry
nuclear
and
energy.
other assets, are you saying that
But
you're
not
against
the way
It isn't
the
gonna
current
happen in a
non-business
month
men
or
and women
something.
in
I'll
government
bet you any money you
and
like.
our
We do not
administrations
take a single possession
administer
of
it.
anybody. Well, unless
Just
it's
have a look at Sizewell,
of
have a look
anybody
at Hinkley
crossing the
Point,
English Channel
have a look at
by
ballooning costs,
dinghy. And as
have a
Zia
look
says,
at time delay,
you know,
and look
if I
to
dare
South Korea.
To answer your question,
South Korea do
in the
nuclear energy
affirmative, I
with
can't
no
even imagine
concessions to safety at
what some of the
25% of
historic
the cost that the British
parallels
do. Yes,
that
there'll be
would
obstacles
drawn
with planning and
published
much else,
would be.
but we absolutely
And that really gets to
have
the heart
to
of
do
yesterday's
this for our
event.
future.
You know, it was
Our current
performative to a
politicians
very,
are not
very
good
large
enough.
degree.
Our
Even if she
current
believes this stuff
politicians
herself,
don't understand
and clearly
business.
she is very
Our
much more from
current
the Blue
politicians
Labour
don't
wing of the
understand
party.
money.
Even if she believes it
Just
herself,
look at the continuing
just
farce
isn't going
of
to
HS2 to understand just how
Camilla Tominey for the
useless
Telegraph.
they really are.
Sorry.
And we will,
I'm
if we
happy
win
to
that
take
next
that role.
election,
So
bring
we wouldn't
in
even categorise it.
seasoned
So listen,
professionals.
we want a hard
good,
cap foreign aid at
but good
£1
not
billion
just at
for the
managing
foreseeable,
money,
right, until
but with
Britain's
expertise
finances
in
in a
their
position
own
where
industry.
hard-working bricklayers
bring
in this
in
country are not being
private
asked to pay
sector
ever more
specialist
tax.
knowledge.
In
Of that,
terms of
there
making
is
it
no
conditional,
question.
well, what we would say, as we outlined
And generally
in
on
Operation
business,
Restoring
and I
Justice,
saw
our
this in
deportation
Brussels,
plan,
I'm seeing this
we,
too in
we
Westminster.
allocated £2 billion specifically.
The government
for
only listens to big business.
Foreign nations to
It
take
only
back
listens, in fact,
their
in most
illegal migrants.
cases,
So we
to
wouldn't even call that
multinationals
foreign aid. That's
that
very
aren't
simple.
really British companies at
You know,
all.
here's an
They're the
incentive
ones
to take back
that
your
have
illegal
the
migrants
ear
in our
of
country,
business.
so that we can.
I guess they're the
basically
ones
ensure
that
we have
provide the
proper
tickets for
immigration.
Wimbledon, the dinners,
Camilla Tominey,
and all
Telegraph.
the rest of it.
Morning, thank you.
There is a
Camilla Tominey,
huge
Daily Tea.
ignored
just a
sector
personnel question,
in this
mindful
country.
of the fact that you
A
think there's going to be a
sector
general election
who
in
are the
2027.
genuine engine
and you've
for
been very
growth
critical
in the
of
UK
the current
economy.
Chancellor.
A sector
You've
we
scrapped
cannot
the tax
do without
cuts that Richard Tice
if we're
wrote
to
into
turn
the contract
round
with the people
the
at
current
the last
dismal
general
state
election.
of
If Zia
the
Youssef
British
is now
economy.
crunching the numbers
They
for the
are
announcements you're making today,
rarely
should
talked
we
about.
presume
They
that
are
he's your
ignored,
preferred choice for
but they are put
Chancellor
upon. Just think
over
of the
Richard Tyson?
30% increase
Lovely
that Mr.
try,
Hunt brought
but you
in
should
for corporations
No, it's very
tax,
good. I mean, no wonder you're so
stifling
well paid.
reinvestment. Just think of this government.
But I'm just
Take
not
their
playing
annual
your silly little
returns.
game. Sorry.
Now must
right,
be
moving on to the
quarterly
next
returns
question. Max Kendricks
with
from the
added
Times, who was
bureaucracy
covered
and added costs.
local
Yep,
government
the
cancellations
completely
better than
forgotten
any
part
other
of the
journalist.
British economy are the
Thank
5.6
you.
million men and women
couple of questions.
that run small
One on,
businesses,
which was kind of asked
act
before,
as
but would be good
directors,
to get addressed
or
more fully.
organise
Is your
their
aim
lives
to go into the
as
next
sole
election making a
traders.
promise not to
They
raise
feel
any
unwanted
taxes whatsoever? Are
in
there going to be
almost
solid
every
commitments
single
around that?
way.
Or
And
conversely,
yet
do you
they're
think it's
really
an area
important.
that should be taxed more?
60% of employment
Zia, I wonder, Shabana
in the
Mahmood said
private
yesterday,
sector
when
is
she was being accused
provided
of being divisive
by those
by
5.6
Lib Dem
million
MP,
small
that she's the one
companies.
regularly called
They've been hammered
an FNP word
by
and
national
told to go
insurance
back home.
rules
Is that an
over the course of the last year,
racism in
especially
public
those
life that
working
you sympathise
in
with?
hospitality and sectors.
Yeah, well, look, I've
such
answered this a few
as
times
that.
this morning on the morning round. So
And
number
they are
one,
embattled
I deeply
by
sympathise with her for
IR35
being in receipt of,
regulations
such
designed by the
appalling racism.
Treasury
That must be deeply
and weak Conservative
unpleasant. But-
chancellors
And look, obviously
to
different
assume that
politicians
everyone
have
out
different
there
reasons and motivations
who isn't working for a
for
big firm
saying and believing
is some
different
kind
things.
of
I do
crook.
somewhat take exception
Well, I'm
to
sorry,
this
but the
conflation
IR35
with,
rules
or
are
this
ridiculous.
association
They're
with
stifling
concern
innovation.
about immigration,
They even drive some in their
legal and
50s
illegal,
just to throw
and
their
racism.
hands up
I do take
and go
exception to
into
that because
early
for I think
retirement.
decades now, and I've just been
We will
campaigning
be
on this issue for decades.
the party
People in
of
this
small
country
business.
have
We will
voted
be
time and time
the
and
party
time and time
of
again for less
risk-takers.
immigration. Not because they're
And look,
racist,
there is a
not because they're
fundamental, I
running
think,
around shouting the F word or
misunderstanding
using the P word at
in
people,
many, many
but because
ways
they believe
about
Britain should
what
have
business
borders, they
really
believe in
is. It's as if,
sovereignty,
well,
they believe in the
you're
rule of law,
either
and they
for
believe
business
that
in
if you pay
politics,
taxes in this country,
or
you
you're
should
for the
assume
worker
to actually get
in
public
politics.
services that
It
make
is a
sense for you.
fundamental
So I would, it's
misunderstanding,
a subtle thing,
frankly,
and again, I
at
have
every
deep
level.
sympathy, of course, for
Thriving
anyone who receives
businesses
that kind of
are
racist
good for
abuse. Lord
their
knows I've received
employees.
abuse too, just like
And
every
something
frontline
that I don't
politician.
think
But this notion
anybody on
that
the front
wants to
benches would even
conflate
understand
concern about immigration,
is that
as
small
she did in the
businesses
chamber yesterday,
very
with,
often treat their
such appalling
employees
racism.
as
I do
well
have
as
something
they
of
would
an issue
treat
with them.
Yeah,
their
Melanie
own
Phillips in your
family.
newspaper today makes some very similar
You know,
points.
I went
actually,
through
very
times of
powerful,
having to pay monthly payroll
article.
when
Look,
the staff were earning a
we're
lot
a party
more
that believes we
than
need
I
tax
was.
cuts.
But I wouldn't for a
The
minute
tax burden is
want to
too high.
jettison
It's a
any
disincentive.
single one of them.
And by the way, I want
but
lots
hold
of people
tight
moving back
and
to
wait
Britain.
for better times.
I want people moving back
And we
to
are
Britain
on
who
the
are gonna
side
pay
of working
lots and
people.
lots and
We
lots
are
of
the
tax.
party of
Because if you
alarm
drive
clock
away
Britain.
the
And we want
wealthiest,
people
you drive
who are
away
out
the
there
highest
working
taxpayers,
to be
which
genuinely
means a
better off
potentially higher
working
tax
than
burden
they are
for everything
on a
else.
whole
I think
range
what we've shown
of
you,
benefits.
I believe what we
And it's
tried to
perhaps
show
on
you
benefits as much as
over
anything
the course
else
of the last few
that I was
weeks
keen to do this speech
is that we fully
today.
understand
There seem to
that
have
we can't
been
even talk about
several
tax cuts
misunderstandings
until we get our spiralling
as
debt
to where
problem
reform stands
in this country
on benefits,
under
as if
control.
we are the party that will
Equally,
throw around
there
the
needs to be a
money
big change of culture as well,
like
when it comes
confetti.
to work,
Based, I
productivity,
think,
success,
around my comments
and maybe
on the
we should be championing entrepreneurs that do well and make money,
Now,
rather than portraying
no one
as being
actually
evil
listened
for
to what I
having done
said.
well.
I
So
mean,
there are some big cultural
this happens,
shifts
I know.
that are needed as well. No, we want
But what I
tax
said
cuts.
was
the tax burden
we should
is
remove the
too
two-child
high.
cap
We're committed to doing
for
that.
British
but first,
working
we're showing you that we can
couples.
make the cuts and do the
And what I
things
meant by
will
that
give us
is
the
for
room.
lower paid couples
Can
who
I
are
just say
both
one other
working,
thing on that?
the cost
It
of
alludes to an earlier
childcare
question
is
as well,
exorbitant.
which is that I do think
It's
there's
a
something of an
disincentive
underappreciation
for
in
having
the
more
media
children.
about
It's a
the changing
disincentive
financial
for
situation
going
since the
out
last
to
general
work.
election.
And so I thought a tax
and
credit
the country's finances have
for a couple where
deteriorated
both were
meaningfully,
working
even from the
was actually
shambolic and
a
deteriorated state they're in as a result of 14 years of Tory government. And if you were to look,
policy in every
we can have this
single way.
conversation again the day after the budget.
We
My
have already
assessment
announced
is any reasonable assessment,
cuts to welfare
assuming that
spending,
Rachel Reeves does not do the things,
but no one seems to have noticed.
sadly, is that
So let me use
after
this
the budget,
opportunity
just
to
to
reiterate
unwind that
where we are
incremental
this
new
morning.
taxes that Rachel Reeves
My
has
colleague Lee
imposed on the
Anderson
British people,
and Zia
the
Youssef
mad
did
inheritance
a press
tax changes,
conference
including on
earlier on
farmers, a
this
2%
week
increase
dealing
in national insurance
specifically
contributions for
with
employers, the sugar
PIP
tax,
claims,
all of these things you're
saying
talking about will be north
we
of
would take
60
away claims
billion
from
pounds.
people
And
who were
Lord
on
knows
PIP
we would love
for
an early
non-major
general election. But by the time we get to the
anxiety.
next general election, in all
That
likelihood,
policy
my view
alone,
is that we're going to be at north of 100
given
billion
the daily,
pounds
weekly,
just
monthly rate
to
of new
unwind
sign-ons,
the appalling
that
tax
policy
rises
alone
that Rachel Reeves would have implemented.
would
So we've
save
got
us
to be straight up
£9
with the
billion
British
a
people.
year
Absolutely.
by
Jonathan Walker
2029
from the Express.
under current predictions. And in fact,
thank
all
you, Nigel.
disability claims
I think it was
will have to be dealt with
highlighted
in
a
person.
web page that you've set
All
up for people
disability
who are
claims
interested
will have
in
to be
defecting to
reassessed.
reform. I
There'll be
don't
no
suppose
more
Siobhan is
Zoom,
really
5 or
gonna
10 minutes on a
fill it
Zoom,
in, but are you
and
able
be
to tell us
signed off
anything about how
with
many
some
people
sort of
have
malady.
applied?
And there'll be no more
how
family
do you decide
GP
to accept and
feeling
who
pressure
to not accept?
into signing
In terms of
people off.
defectors,
It'll all be
the
done
rule's very,
by
very simple.
independent third
We
party.
want people to come to
And you
us
don't think
who
this
we think will
matters?
add-
Well, just think about this.
Add to
There
us,
has been a
help us as a party,
50%
help us as a movement,
increase
as
in
opposed
disability claims
to
in
simply
Britain
using us as a tool
over the course
to
of
revive
the last
their political
5
careers.
years.
That's the criteria.
We
plain
are
and
over-diagnosing many of these things.
Sophie Wingate from PA.
And in doing so, throwing young British people
Thank
onto
you,
a scrap
Sophie Wingate
heap,
from PA.
marked victim,
On renegotiating with
and
the EU
replacing
on
what they could
benefits
be
for
doing
EU citizens,
by cheap
can you guarantee
imported
that it wouldn't
foreign
lead to retaliatory
labour.
measures
It
and
is
higher
madness,
prices for British consumers?
and I would
have
further
you had
point
any exploratory
to
talks
the Boris
with EU
wave.
officials to see how open
Indefinite
they might be?
leave to remain.
No, I'm
that
not.
begins to kick in
Terribly
very
popular
shortly.
in Brussels most of the time. It has to be said.
For
They're
a
quite pleased to see
million
the back
or
of me in
more
many
people
ways. Although the European
who are in this
Parliament's
country
very, very dull.
who will be
now that the
able to
Brexit
claim
Party aren't
benefits
there.
for the whole of their lives, and
it's a negotiation.
to bring in dependence.
It's a negotiation,
as well.
and you go into a negotiation.
There are some think tanks
with a very
that
clear
estimate
idea
this particular
of what your
cohort
objectives are,
could cost up to
and what your
£200 billion
interests
pounds
are.
over
And your
the course
interests
of
ought to be the
their
national interest.
lifetime.
And the whole disaster
So in terms
of the EU
benefit
renegotiation,
cuts, I think we've just proposed
from the
the biggest
very
benefit
early
cuts
days
you've probably
was
ever
it was
heard any
viewed
government
by
do,
Theresa May and
I will
others
make this
as a
absolute
damage
promise.
limitation
We will
exercise
substantially
as opposed to
cut
a rejuvenating
the benefits bill.
opportunity.
We will
and so we
reduce
finished up with a
the
very bad
size
deal
of
that
the public
currently the
sector.
Prime Minister is trying
We
to
will
make
look,
considerably
as we've already
worse.
started,
We will adopt a different approach.
at public
and you
sector
can never predict
pensions,
how
which are a massive
negotiations will
liability,
go.
and from the early
But I
work
do think
that Richard has done,
that
we
we have a
can see
team of
these
people
funds are
who've been
paying
used to
fees
negotiations,
that are way
who know
out
what
of
the
line
tough side of life
for what
is
should
when
be
it comes to
appropriate
business,
and
when it comes to
being
putting together
badly
contracts,
mismanaged.
putting together deals.
On the cost
And
of
I would argue
living,
we've
we
got a
will
far
cut
better
people's
chance
energy bills. Now, Keir
of doing
Starmer said he'd cut
something
them by
in the national
£300.
interest
They're up
than
to
any of the careerists that have gone
£285.
before us.
And if Mr Miliband's
Maurizio
win plan
Alencar, City AM.
comes in, we'll have locked in higher energy for decades
Hi,
to
Mauricio
come.
Alencar, City
We
AM,
reckon
thank you.
sensibly
Some of the
we could cut
criticism of Labour has been on
£165
plans
per
to
annum
create a
of
so-called
everybody's
smorgasbord of
electricity
tax
bill.
rises based on quite
But it's in
volatile
the area
items.
of
But then
population
this package is
explosion. It's
also
in the
taking
area
up some volatile
of mass
items
migration,
such as
where
net
perhaps we can help a
migration.
lot.
So, you know,
A
is
move
this
towards
savings
net
package
zero
and
population
slight
increase
surcharge
through
fees package
migration
also not
would
based on
ease
very
pressure
sort of
on rents.
unpredictable forecasts?
It would ease pressure
Right.
on house
No.
price
Just have a look at the graph.
affordability.
Well, your City AM,
and
for
we will
goodness
commit
sake. Just have a
to
look
the
at the
biggest
trend.
building programme
The trends have now
of
been well
genuinely
established for several
affordable
years.
housing
And
in this
actually,
country
the numbers
that
are
has
getting worse, and the
ever
predictions
been seen.
for those
Our young
numbers,
people
whether it's
deserve
PIP,
nothing
whether it's
less.
universal credit, all of
So
this
look, we
will be
will
considerably worse this time
cut
next year,
spending.
and even worse
We will
the year
encourage
after
growth
that. The trend
and
is very,
entrepreneurship.
very clear. We
want
this is
to
about
cut
arresting
taxes, of course we
and
do.
turning around.
But we
that
understand
Yeah, and I
substantial
would just add
tax
to that, the
cuts,
only
given
number
the dire
that could in
state
any
of
way
debt
be
and our
described
finances
as
are not
being reliant on a
realistic
variable
at this current
is the one
moment
on
in
IHS
time.
that you flagged.
There
the
are some relatively
the
modest
immigration
things we
health
would do.
surcharge. The
We
£5
would
billion number we
immediately
just
remove
touted as being savings
IHT
based on the
from
current
family
OBR
farms
forecast for net immigration. But I also said in my
and
speech, because we've done the
family-run
numbers on this,
businesses.
if they cut net
And
immigration
we
to
will
zero,
raise the
which is what our
threshold
policy is, it would
at which
still
people
save north
start to
of
pay
£3
tax
billion quid. So that's still
to
£23
begin the
billion,
process
more than enough to
of getting
negate
people
the
out
tax rises.
of the 16-hour-a-week
Casanuccio
working
from
debt trap
Politico.
that so many people
find
thank you very
themselves
much, Emilio.
in. The state
You
of the
say
finances,
that
the state of the
you
economy
made
is
those
far,
specific
far worse
promises about council tax
than it
before
was
those
in the
elections,
run-up
but
to the 2024
reform
general
local
election.
groups did
But
make
be in
very
no
clear
doubt,
promises.
we are pro-business.
So what will
Be
you
in
do
no
to
doubt,
keep better
we
control
want
over
work to
what
be
these people
rewarded.
promise
Be in no
on
doubt,
essentially your behalf
we
in
will do
local
everything
areas?
we can
And are you
to
able to
bring
say
back
something
confidence
just a bit more general
and to bring
about
back a
that
change of
experience,
culture
what councils,
around
these
work,
reform councils
money,
are finding, the
and
challenges that they're
success
finding in terms
in
of saving
this
money,
country?
or in terms
And
of
be in
making
no
difficult
doubt
decisions for
that
savings
we will
that
have
actually are
higher
proving very unpopular
quality
or the government
people
won't let them do.
in charge of
What have you
areas
learned
over which they've got
from
knowledge
this experience
than we've
of
seen
some
in this
form of
country
governance
for many,
about what you
many
should be promising
decades?
ahead of the
Thank you very much.
election and how a reform government might need to kind of temper expectations?
I was incredibly careful.
For the
Incredibly
5.6
careful
million
in the run up to those county
very
elections,
brave men and women
not to make
who act
false
as sole
economic
traders
promises.
or run
And I
their own
promise
businesses,
you will not find a
without which
leaflet
the British economy,
officially
frankly,
sanctioned by the
would
party.
grind
You will not find
to
a
a halt.
clip or an excerpt
And I think we
of
can say
anything
with
I
some
said
confidence
on the
that
street
this budget will
or
be
on
very, very
camera
good for
or
those
to you or
who
wherever
don't
it
want
may
to work
be where I
and
made
want to live on
any
benefits,
false
which is very
claims
different
about
to a
tax
civilised
and council
society
tax.
looking after
And I can
those
assure
that are
you,
unable
having
to look
travelled
after
and
themselves.
having met
And it'll be an
can't even
attack
think,
on jobs.
but
I have to say, I thought the
probably
budget
800
last year,
of the
you know, you
1,300
can
people
increase the
that stood,
minimum
600
wage
that
for
stood
young
for us.
people.
I
But if at
didn't
the
hear
same
anyone
time
making false promises
you bring
on
down
council
to
tax.
£5,000
So I think, you know,
the level at
the
which
messages
an
that
employer
were coming
starts to pay
from the
national
Central
insurance,
Party
is it any wonder
through
that there
the
are
senior membership
50,000
team
fewer
were very,
under
very
18s
loud and clear.
in employment today
Lessons,
than there were this time last
yeah,
year, which
I mean,
culturally
I think
is an absolute
getting anything to change
disaster.
in this country is difficult.
What is clear
It's difficult
is that the
because of
markets
inertia.
are
It's
increasingly
difficult
nervous.
because of the status
I know that
quo.
Andy
It's
Burnham
difficult
thinks that
because
doesn't matter.
there are plenty of people
But actually,
living
the
in the
bond markets
marzipan
in the end
land.
are enormously powerful,
You know, on a
as Liz
public
Truss's
sector
government
with the
found
promise of great
to
pensions,
their
with
cost.
maybe not the longest
And
working
amidst all of
hours
this,
in the
we have a
world, many of
Chancellor
them
who is
thinking since
absolutely
the pandemic
hopelessly
that actually work from
out of
home
her
was a
depth.
suitable alternative.
Out of her depth to a level that,
getting
frankly,
things to
it's
change
embarrassing.
is
It was
hard.
Lee Anderson
I think that's
who
perhaps
called
the
her
biggest
Rachel
thing that
from
I
accounts
take
during
from these
PMQs
first few months.
some time ago,
and that is to a very
really
large
stuck.
extent
Although
why
Lee now says he
it's
feels
getting
sorry for
back
her
to the express
on a human
question,
level.
really. That's
And
very
actually,
much why Danny
I think we can
Kruger
all understand that.
has come into the party.
So what we're
to
going to get is a
oversee team,
budget
to
that will be
think
drafted by
how
left-wing
are we
think
going
tanks, a budget that will
to
be
deal with these
drafted by
challenges
people
with
who've
Whitehall
never
and
run a
elsewhere.
business.
But yeah, that's my big takeout.
Who've never
Okay,
had
we're
a
rattling through.
proper
Will Hazel
job
from the
in
iPaper.
their lives, and that's the level of disconnect that exists.
Do you support Shabana
Now, I do
Mahmood's
think we're setting the
plan
pace
to deport the children
on a number of
who failed
things. I thought,
asylum
despite
seekers? Because I think
her
earlier in the year,
protestations, I thought a lot of what
rode
Shabana
back
Mahmood
on
said
plans
yesterday was
to
driven
deport the
directly by
children of
fear
illegal migrants
that
in your
Labour
mass
are
deportation
losing
plan.
votes, particularly in the
Look,
Red
you know,
Wall,
my job is not to make your life
reform.
easier. And so I'm going to
rhetorically,
say this. The
we would agree
absolute
with a lot
priority
of
with
what the Home
deporting
Secretary
those who've
said.
come illegal
Indeed, there are some
are
of us that
young,
thought it might just be
undocumented
a
males
pitch.
of fighting
Maybe
age.
that's our next defector.
Many
I'm not
of
sure.
whom will do great
If her
harm in
backbenchers
this
vote
country
against her, that could
to
become
women,
a
to
bigger
girls,
likelihood.
join crime gangs, and that is
There was
the
no
absolute
doubt,
priority, and
as
that
I say, that we
remains
led the
my
agenda
answer.
on that.
Lucy White from
That
Bloomberg.
illegal migration is making the country very, very
Thank you.
angry. And she said
I
it's,
wanted to ask about
tearing the
steel.
country
At the
apart.
moment, the EU has
But
proposed much
economically,
higher tariffs on steel that we are
it
trying
is
to
legal
negotiate our way
migration
out of.
that is doing
If you were to
enormous
torpedo
damage
relations
to
with
the
the
British
EU by, for
economy,
example,
and it's been
withdrawing from
so
the ECHR
difficult
or
to even
by
talk about this
treating
subject
their
without
citizens
being
here
screamed
differently to
down.
the way we treat our
But
own.
just look at the direct link
How do you expect that
between
to
falls in
impact on
productivity
these
and the mass
industries that are so
importation
reliant
of
on
unskilled labour? But that
our
trend has
relations with
been
the
there
EU? Because
now
the
for
steel
the best
industry has
part
said the
of
tariffs at the current
20
level that the EU is
years.
proposing would be incredibly
There are
damaging.
enormous costs.
No, and I understand
to our
that.
benefit
That's all part of a
system
negotiation,
those,
isn't it?
not
That's
just illegally,
all part of a
but legally
negotiation.
have
And,
come
you know, when
to our
you're
country.
negotiating
And
against someone that
today,
sees weakness,
Zia is going to address some of that.
They will keep
as
hammering
indeed we
you.
touched on
Yeah,
before.
that is the world
idea,
that we live in. And we've shown weakness since
at an
2016.
alternative press conference
Time
today,
after time after
which
time.
I understand
And
is going
frankly,
on at the same time
under
as this
Keir
one,
Starmer's leadership,
is
it
that
is
somehow
craven.
reform
weakness
support
that we're seeing
and
on
ballooning
fishing and everything else.
benefits
So yes,
bill. And
these
yet
are issues,
we're the ones proposing
as are trade
the most
issues around the
radical
whole of
cuts
the
to
rest of the world.
benefits in
But this is
numerical
about
terms
a complete
that have
reset
ever been seen
of our
in the history
relationship, and one that is
of
much more
this country.
in our national interest.
So I'm going to ask
And,
Zia
you know, steel
to
is a very
lay
difficult
out
subject anyway.
our key 5 points
I honestly
today.
don't believe
We'll then, of course,
that
take
if Richard Tyson
questions
had
on
not
that
gone up to Scunthorpe
and
on
anything
that day,
else,
I
as we
honestly
always
don't
do.
believe this
But I want you to
country
bear
would be
in
producing
mind,
any
with all the
primary
numbers that
steel
Zia's
at
about to
all.
give you,
And that moves on to a whole
these
bigger
are
debate
before
on energy and the sheer
Boris
catastrophe.
wave. Before the
net
Boris
zero,
wave begins
the
to
attempt
become
the
eligible,
Saudi Arabia
and
of
for
wind,
everything the Home Secretary has
and
said
onto this government
about extending
is
the number
for
of years you
not
have to
just
be in
our
Britain
traditional
to
manufacturing
qualify,
industries, but
whether it's for
forget data
ILR,
centres,
whether it's for
forget
benefits.
AI, forget
I don't
crypto,
see any changes
forget the entire
happening to the Boris wave,
21st
and those
century
numbers
economy
will start
if we
to
continue
hit by the
with our
end
current energy
of this
policy.
year, predicted
we simply
by some
won't
think tanks
be competitive
to
and
perhaps
won't
be
able
one
to
of the
do it.
single biggest
And energy
economic
will be,
mistakes this country
very
has
much,
ever made
I think, a
in its
centrepiece.
history.
I'll now hand over to some of the details that you might have heard already on broadcast media this morning. I'll hand over
to our head of policy, Zia Youssef.
No, not here. Adam Cherry, Guido.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming and for watching, if you're watching this on a live stream.
Thank
so,
you. The
tough
Chancellor
decisions
next
need
week
to be
is set
made
to announce
is the refrain
a
of the
milkshake
political
tax.
class for
What is
years,
Reform's
decades
position?
now.
My favourite
British
subject.
citizens
What is
constantly being
Reform's
told
position
that they need to
on
tighten
sin
their
taxes? You
belts
mentioned
and they've
the
got to
sugar tax
accept
earlier. Would you abolish
paying
it?
ever
And
more
under a
tax
Reform government, if I
for
go into
ever
a
worse
restaurant, would I
public
be able to
services.
buy a
While
Coca-Cola
that's
and
been
get it
happening,
refilled
as
on
we're
limited
about to lay
times?
out,
Oh,
there
I've
has been the
seen
most
that.
extraordinary
it's as if
ballooning
we're all
of British
protected from
taxpayer
ourselves
expense
and kept
being
at home,
funneled to
wrapped up
foreign
in cotton
nationals,
wool.
including on our own